Hey there guys, TC Mabe from TC Gaming. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about ACF and the ACF sample regarding items and equipment and armor and things like that. This one's going to be mostly about items, and we'll see what kind of time we have left, and I might break them up into equipment and armor because each one of them are very similar in nature, but they have their nuances. So what I want to talk about right away is inside of the inventory sample. If you go in here, you'll see that over on the side you have these interactables, and you can come over and see that you can interact with your arrows, and you can come over and interact with the offhand sword and interact with the base armor, but they all look like loot bags. Now these are different items and objects and things that can be equipped. The way to fix these is if you go into the static mesh that represents this instance in the world, you can go down to the details panel, and you can come over here and you can make some changes to these settings and, as far as what's in the bag and things like that. But what's important to understand about these things is that this is a world item. The ACF Ultimate World Item or ACF World Item, depending on which one you're using. I think they're pretty much the same thing, but there might be some changes. One of the things that you'll run into here is that even if I change the static mesh representation of this in the world, when I take it into inventory and then drop it, it's going to turn back into a loot bag because of the settings on the actual thing that's in the game. So let's take a look down that path here. So the thing that's in here, let's go to the one that actually has, I think there's a sword in this one. So I'm going to highlight this version right here. And you'll see as we scroll down through here that there is an ACF array for the item. And in here, this is where you specify the blueprint. So in this case, it's the ACF left sword BP. If I navigate to that, I'll find it here. Now, I don't have a way of representing that sword in the world. I don't have a static mesh for it. And I'll show you what I mean here. If I go into the static mesh for this, I don't think there's a sword static mesh in here, see? So what we need to do to represent this, we need to go and make a static mesh. So the easy way to do this is to find the blueprint for it, go in here and get the mesh, the skeletal mesh that's actually used for this item, or this weapon or whatever it is. Go out into the skeletal mesh editor, and there's a little button here that says make static mesh. And normally you want to make these, I'm going to move this over, let's bring these things down into the editor space here so that they're just windows within the same container. What I'd like to do is go out and say make static mesh, and I'm going to put that where this is, so it's under full sample blueprint items. So I'll say make static mesh, and it's going to say full sample blueprint items. And actually I could put it with the sword. The sword is under asset items sword. So let me put it in there, and I'll call it SM underscore, and I think it's called the blade dragon sword, so I'll call it blade underscore dragon sword. And this is going to be the representation of this in the world. So let's hit OK. And over here, if we go back to where that location was, it was under assets and items and sword. I've now created a blade dragon sword skeletal mesh object here. Okay, we'll just save that real quick. So I'm going to go and I'm going to put this on the instance of the item that's out here in this world, this loot bag. So now I have a static mesh for it, so I can say SM underscore blade, and it'll pop up, and I can assign that, and it's going to get assigned to that bag. Okay, now you notice that it's pretty big. So the reason that is because the scale of this is set to 2.5, so we'll go in here and make it 111. Okay, and now if I go out into the world, I will see that I have a sword where I used to have a bag. And I can go over here to the sword and stand near it and go interact with that sword. Oh, doesn't work. Why is that? So I can pick this up. I can come over here and I can pick this up, but I can't pick this up. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is because this object that I just changed this into doesn't have any collision settings on it. So what we want to do is go into the small blade dragon sword static mesh, We want to set collisions on it. So the easy way to do this is to go to the collision drop down and just go to auto convex collision, and it's going to pick a thing that it thinks will work for you pretty well. You just hit apply, and it'll go and create, in this case, 4 Hull and 16 max Hull verts around this object. I think if you increase this number here, you'll get it tighter, around the thing here. We could actually try that, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So you can experiment with these settings. If you don't like this, you can also go back up to the collision. You can remove those collisions and then set it to one of these other ones, but most of these don't work as well as actually just wrapping something around the hull. So if I hit save current and we go back out here and play again, what we should find now is that I have the sword, and see, I can interact with it again because I now have collision on for the item that's there. But if I go into my inventory and I take that offhanded sword and I drop it, look what I have again. I have a loot bag out in the world. Well, why is that? I picked up a sword. Why am I dropping a loot bag? Well, the reason for that is because the blueprint for that item has the loot bag as the default mesh for anything that's dropped in the world. So what we want to do to fix it is we would go over here. Let's go and find the blueprint. Again, that's specified in this droppable. We'll go to ACF left sword BP and find that. And inside of here, we can go down now. And I normally just go into the blueprint editor and then just scroll down, and there's going to be under the mesh, there will be a section in here that says what the world mesh is going to be. And that is, where's it at? Actually, it might be on the BP. Under item, world mesh. And so now I can go in here and say SM_blade for the dragon sword. So I've specified that now, and that's what's going to happen when the world mesh gets created. Okay, so if I go out again, save, now I can go back over here, and again I should be able to pick up my offhand sword, and when I go over here and I drop the offhand sword, I should see an offhand sword placed in the world that I can still interact with. Okay, so that's the basics of how that's set up as far as creating, the instance of the item in the world that you actually want to interact with. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that that's going on in here, and we can talk about that real quick. If we go into all the details on the sword, in this particular case, this sword is a melee weapon. So when this got created, it got created as a child of the ACF melee weapon class. And because it's a melee weapon, it picks up some of these things. Now, one of them is the collision component. In the collision manager, the ACM, which is over here, you have a thing called damage. And then the ACM section down here, you have a thing called damage traces. And you can specify the radius and the type of damage and the sockets where this all happens. Also the line trace length and the start socket and all that kind of stuff. If this were a bullet or projectile, I think is where that comes in. But in here for your damage, you can come in here and specify all that stuff. Now the sockets for that are actually being applied inside the skeletal mesh. When you go into the skeletal mesh, you go into the skeleton tree, and here's where you're going to put your sockets. If you don't know how to do that, you just right click on here and say add socket. Whatever these names are is going to specify the spot. So as we saw over here, start and end under the damage traces. Just had them in here somewhere. Where did it go? On the collision component. For the start and end sockets, that's what this is here. It's going to draw a trace between the start and the end to determine whenever you attack with that thing, it's going to flip that on and check to see if you made collision with any of the objects. So, again, you can change some of the parameters of that in here. Now, as the item information in here and the equipable portion of this, there's all kinds of stuff you can set in here with your modifiers. Up here, because it's a weapon, you can specify the handle type. This is an offhand weapon. You can also specify an attachment offset. So what this is for is if you had something that didn't fit quite right. Let's say it's from another set, and you went in there and you made a blueprint, and all your items had a slight offset to them. You could fix it here using an offset in this range, or you could also go into the sockets and move it in the skeleton itself. But usually you'll use an offset in one of these areas here under that attachment. The weapon type, that's the classification it falls under. The move set tells you what the character does whenever it equips this thing. So in this case here, it just uses the standard moveset, but you could have a single hand sword moveset, or like say a fencing moveset, or a two-handed sword moveset, and your character is going to run differently or stand idle differently using those animations that are tied to that moveset. This one's just default. In the moveset actions, you also have this moveset single hand sword. So when you call an animation on your character, let's go out here and I'll show you where that's actually happening. If we go out here to world settings, we can look at our game override, ACF full player, go out to the full player blueprint. And if we look in here, he's got a mesh with an animation BP. That animation BP has in it, under the class defaults here, we've got actions and movesets. This moveset in here is called ACF moveset for the actions. There's going to be a moveset for, or I'm sorry, where is it? Let me move this over here. Moveset single hand sword. So under movesets, there should be a moveset for the single hand sword. Moveset single hand sword under, there it is, under moveset actions. So moveset single hand sword has these two different things that can happen whenever you're using that. So when you hit the actions.attack button while holding this ACF sword, it's going to go in here and fire the actions.attack. And it's going to play the sword attack montage, and it's going to do the ACF attack action blueprint to follow all that in. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of this in one of the other videos talking about the animations and animation blueprints and retargeting of characters. But here's how it actually applies to the weapons. So on the weapon configuration or the item configuration, and again, like I said, these all kind of merge together with items and attachments and equipment and weapons. They're all kind of similar derivatives of the same thing. But if you go in here, that's where you're specifying what actions are available based on holding this equipment. The on-body socket name, of course, is telling you on the skeleton where that lands when you stick it in the equipment. So left-hand sword equip is going to go into a specific socket on the body. You can find that by going back to your ACF full player. You could go in here and find the mesh, and you could go over here and get that mesh, say find skeleton off of the mesh, and open that up. And then in here you're going to have all these different sockets. So here's LH sword equip, which is over here. If you want to see how that looks, you can go in here and say add preview asset, type in sword in the, type in sword in the search asset box, and you'll get that blade dragon sword. So that's what it looks like in the sword equip slot for the left hand weapon. The right hand weapon has its own in here somewhere, I'm sure. Maybe it's just called single hand sword equip and the other one's LH. Probably that's what they did. Yeah, so here's where the other one equips. But that's just a little bit more about how this is configured. Where does it land on the body? When I equip it, it's asking me the same thing over here. It goes in hands on a socket called left weapon. So if we go back to the mannequin skeleton, there should be a socket in here somewhere called left weapon. And that is where left weapon is up here. And as you would guess, that is attached to hand_L, the bone up here. So that's going to go in his left hand because it's a left-handed sword in this particular example. Talking a little bit more about some of these things, you can also have unsheathed modifiers. So when you pull this sword out, what it can do to your character. In this case here, it looks like it adds a little bit of strength to it. You can also go in here and say defense modifiers, and you can configure all these things in here to change the parameters of these items and weapons. Gives you the item weight, what the thumbnail looks like in your inventory. Again, we set this at the world mesh earlier. This is the item slot that it goes into. So item slot dot left hand weapon. If you bring this under your character, you have to make sure that on your character, when you look at the character's equipment component, which is down here, under available equipment slots, you have to make sure that that equipment slot that is specified in this weapon, item slot dot left hand weapon, is also available, item slot dot left hand weapon, on the character, to specify that that can actually go in there. Now, and this is all in starting items here. You can go and put in whatever types of things you want that character to start with. So he does start with a regular sword, and then he can pick up a left-hand sword. So here's his ACF sword right there, is the regular sword. Okay, and I get one of those when I start, but that's where all this is configured. So this is, again, another aspect of equipment. It comes into your equipment component, items, equipment, and attachments and armor and all that kind of stuff, again, are all related in this kind of way. If I go back out here, what else can I tell you about that? You can specify, again, other things in here as far as like currency values, and I think that's pretty much it with the setups of this. I told you about the collision component, how to specify what the mesh looks like, and I think that's pretty much it for how to get this in the world that way. Now what we want to look at is how do we get it to not be straight up in the air like a spike, but actually fall to the ground like a normal object would when you put it into the world. Okay, so for the first thing I want to do is I want to go in here for trying to get this to use the physics type aspect. As I said before, these are world items because they're placed out in the world. So let's go and look at the ACF Ultimate World Item BP. And in here you should find, let's look for physics. And physics are actually on the object mesh. And there's a button here that says Simulate Physics. Now, when I turn that on and compile it, that should apply. Let's look at the details panel and look at the physics down here. Simulate Physics should now be on for all these things because I changed it in the master item here for the world item. So if we go to world item here, let's go to browse to asset just so it's easier to get back to. Now when I hit play, all those items dropped right through the map. We didn't see it in time because we weren't looking that way, but if we go over here, and I'll show you what that error says in a second. We go over here to our start for the player. We'll just rotate ourselves around here. So when we start, we should see those items. See, they fell right through the ground. I don't know if you saw that or not, but you should have. Try and watch it one more time. Yeah, you see them disappear. Now, what the warning is an invalid simulate option. So it's saying the items are set to simulate physics, but the collision that is enabled is incompatible. So what we do with that is we want to go back to this world item BP, and we want to look at the collision settings. So let's go collision, and under the collision, we have a couple different settings in here. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to try the preset for physics actor. We'll see how that works. So let's compile it and go back out here and see if that does anything. Okay, so now we have physics actor turned on, and that object has now fallen to the ground. You can set and kick that bag. But what I've done is I've lost the ability to interact with this object. So let's go and fix that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the blueprint, and under the object mesh for the collision settings, I'm going to take this off physics actor. I'm going to put it back onto custom. And I believe if we go into custom and turn the pawn back on for overlap, I think that fixes it. Let's just see. Items are still there. Okay, still no interaction. So let's go back into the blueprint and fix it. Okay, after some playing around in here, trying to get this set the way that I think it should be. I'm not 100% sure, but this worked for me, so hopefully this works for you guys. You can report back if it doesn't. If you go into the ACF Ultimate World Item Object Mesh and go in here and put physical material on this thing, I just put default physical material on it. I'm not sure if that was the thing that fixed any of this, but that's what I did. I told it to simulate physics, and then down here under the collisions, I told it to use a custom, but that custom initially was set to pawn. And so these are the settings that I had on here. So basically it's tracing visibility in IK, team 4 and neutral, and then it blocks camera and everything else except for team 4 and neutral. What you end up with in there as it's generating the simulating the physics is you'll see it all falls down and the sword falls down, and if I go over here I can still interact with this object. There's my base armor, my offhand sword, my arrows. If I go over here I can kick this bag, right? So it's still generating the events. Now what you'll notice on this last part is that if I take that and I go back again and I drop this equipment, whatever it was that I picked up, remember I only specified the offhand sword looked like the offhand sword. The other ones are still their originals. You'll see here that these stand up and they're not, they don't have their physics turned on. Okay. And the reason for this, I believe, is because this comes out as a world item that is placed at that location. I don't think I can interact with it and knock it down or anything. But what we're going to do is we're going to work on fixing that. And the answer to that, I believe, is in here. If you go to content and you type in inventory, you have this inventory submenu. When you drop an item, it pulls up this section here. You go to the graph. And when you drop the item, it goes through here and it calls this drop item effect. Now, this drop item is actually in code. And what I want to do is, instead of dropping the item this way, what I want to actually do is remove it from the ACF inventory and then spawn a new instance of it and drop it into the world with physics turned on. Okay, so I'm going to do that in, I'll just basically wire the code up and then I'll come back in here and we'll just talk about how I did it so you guys don't have to sit there and watch me drag wires out of these things for 10 minutes. Okay, picking up where we left off here, I got to thinking about this. The drop item code actually just places the thing in the world at your feet, and it's not actually the cause of the problem. We could rewire this to do other things. But it also occurred to me that if you had something like ammo or things that have a count to them that you've depleted some in your inventory, spawning a new instance of it would cause potential issues. And to edit this drop item, I believe you actually have to go into the C++ code. So after doing a little bit more digging, what I realized was that if you go out here and you hit play, actually, let me go and resize this instance here real quick. I had made a change here on the size of this. So this one actually should be set to 1, 1, and 1. Just disregard that. It's just the size of the item. So anyway, when we go over here to play, if I go over here and I pick up this sword that we were dealing with earlier, and I go over here and I drop the sword, when I go into my inventory and hit drop, we had this issue where dropping the item leaves it standing up like this with no physics on it. And I got to thinking about why that was. So let me show you real quick. If you hit Shift F1, it's going to give you back control of your mouse. And you go over here and hit eject. It's going to detach you from this player. And you can go over here and highlight this sword. And what you notice is that this is actually an ACF World Item BP and not an ACF Ultimate World Item BP. So there's two different BPs in here. One is the thing that's being dropped and the other is the thing that you're picking up. Now, I'm not sure why that is, and I don't know that you need to have two different ones. I think you could switch it. But what I do know is that in the project settings, if you go in here, let me stop this for a second, but if you go into the settings for the project, and you go into the Ascent Combat Framework settings, down here you have a default class that you can expand out, and it has the World Item class. So right here, the ACF World Item BP is what's being dropped in the world. If I go and change this to ACF Ultimate World Item BP, that's the thing that's in the particular sample that we're in, if I go back out and hit play again, what you should find now, that you're going to see something a little strange here, but when I pick this up and drop it, it is going to have physics on it because we changed the physics on the world item, the ultimate world item. So if I go in here and drop it, what you'll see is that it actually drops, but you'll also see that it's a huge sword, and that's because, but see, I can still interact with it, but the reason that is because in this ACF Ultimate World item, if you were to browse to asset and go in here, it's because the object mesh has a default scale on it of 2.5, so we want to go in here and say 1, 1, and 1. Now, that's going to cause another interesting behavior out here, which is that now these loot bags that are in the world are smaller than what you want them because that's their size. And there's a couple different ways to change this, but an easy way is to just go out here into the world of the instance that you've placed down, and you can change the scale here. So I'll just go set these individual ones back to 2.5, 2.5, and 2.5, if that matters to you at all. 2.5 here, 2.5 there, 2.5 here, and we'd set this one to 1. So you can scale these however you want to in the world instance or in the, I must have missed something there. Okay, just the view I have on it. So there's your loot bags back to normal size. There's your sword back to whatever size you had it scaled at 1. If I pick that up now and come over here and drop it in the world, you'll see that I now have a normal size sword, and that normal size sword drops with physics. And I can go over here and I can pick it up. Now, the other thing that we want to check real quick is how this works in multiplayer. So if we go in here and put ourselves in 2-player and play as a listen server, and then we can hit play. I'll minimize that over to the corner and move this around. Get my Visual Studio window out of the back here. And so we have 2 players on screen. You can see my other guys over here. I'd put 2-player starts in. So if I go over and I pick up the sword, and I'm going to hit Shift F1 to get my thing back, and I'll come over here and grab this guy. We can see that sword's gone. It's disappeared from the world. And we can go over here. Now, there's an interesting thing I noticed right away. In this player's view, those 2 bags have fallen over, and in this player's view, those bags are still upright. So, the reason that happens is because of replication for movement. We'll take care of that in a second if we need to. Probably want to, just to make sure everything's consistent. So if I go back to this player that has the sword, I can hit drop, and you see that both players, you can see over here that it did see it drop, and it fell to the ground, and it also dropped over here and fell to the ground. And that's because that must have some replicated movement on it. But let's just take care of this bag real quick, see if we can fix that. And we'll go into the bag, ACF Ultimate World item, and I think that it's as simple as saying in here, there's a thing in here for replication for movement. So I'm just going to put replicate movement on here, and I believe that will simply fix it. So both players will see the same thing. So if I came over here with this character, for example, and move this bag, so now both players see the same results. I can go over here and kick those, and they'll show up on both screens. So just, if any of this stuff is things that you're trying to solve, I mean, that's kind of a way that you can get in there and figure some of that stuff out. Hopefully this video has helped you a little bit with understanding the world item and how these settings can be changed to add some physics to these objects and make this a little bit better. In the next video, or in a future video, we'll talk a little bit more about actually building the sword and building the shield and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, my name's TC with TC Made with TC Gaming. Hopefully this helped you out, and I'll catch you guys in a future video. Take care of yourselves.